The multiverse does not announce its wounds. There is no thunderclap when reality tears, no warning klaxon blaring across the stars. There is only silence, and then there is a seam, a hairline fracture between what is and what should not be. And through that seam, anything can fall. On a quiet training ground on the outskirts of West City, Vegeta was losing his patience, which was, by any measure, an unremarkable Tuesday. Again, Goku said, grinning, dropping into a stance that had cracked open the ozone layer more than once in its lifetime. I don't need to hear it from you, Vegeta snapped, flexing fingers that still trembled faintly from the last exchange. Blue lightning crackled faintly along his arms, the telltale afterglow of a body pushed to its divine limit, and asked, cheerfully, for more. Where is he? He said he'd referee. He was Beerus, and Beerus was, at that exact moment, floating cross-legged several feet above the sparring field with his tail twitching in slow, irritated arcs. The god of destruction had been promised by Whis that Earth's cuisine had evolved considerably since his last visit. He had been promised a very specific pudding. The pudding had not materialized. This is an outrage, Beerus muttered, to no one in particular, though his voice carried the particular gravity of a being who had erased entire star systems over lesser grievances. I was promised custard. I was promised layers. Lord Beerus, Goku called up, not breaking stance. You want to spar instead? Might take your mind off it. It was, in retrospect, the wrong thing to say to a god who had just been denied dessert. Beerus's eyes narrowed. Something in the air changed, not loudly, not visibly, but every living thing within a mile radius felt it. Birds went silent mid-flight, insects froze, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. A god of destruction's irritation is not an emotion, so much as a physical law temporarily suspended and reconsidered. Fine, Beerus said, and snapped his fingers. He had not meant to do what came next. That would become important later. A detail Beerus himself would spend an uncomfortable amount of time avoiding, since gods do not enjoy admitting to accidents. The snap was meant to be a small, focused burst of destructive energy, a dramatic gesture more than an actual attack, the divine equivalent of slamming a door. But a god of destruction's smallest gestures are never actually small, and this one caught the edge of something ancient and thin stretched across the fabric of that particular patch of sky. A fault line so old and so quiet that even Whis, watching lazily from a nearby hill with his ever-present staff, hadn't registered it. The fault line did not so much break as unzip. Light poured out of nowhere and everywhere at once, not gold or white, but a wrong color. A color that didn't belong in any spectrum Goku's Scion eyes had ever catalogued. The training field's grass flattened outward in a perfect circle, as though the world itself was leaning away from what was happening above it. Goku, Vegeta started, and that was as far as he got. The seam widened into a maw, silent and absolute, and it did not ask permission. It simply took Beerus first, still mid-scowl, tail lashing in surprise more than fear. Then Goku, who had just enough time to throw Vegeta a look that was equal parts alarm and, infuriatingly, excitement. Then Vegeta himself, cursing in a language that predated the Frisia Force, reaching for a fistful of nothing as the training field, the hills, the pudding-shaped grievance of an entire afternoon, all fell away behind him. Whis, for his part, simply blinked, tilted his head, and said to the empty field, "Well, that's new," before calmly deciding it was probably fine and going to go find some actual pudding himself. They landed hard, or rather, two of them landed hard. Beerus simply hovered unbothered, as though mildly interrupted rather than flung across the boundary of existence. Goku hit a rooftop and rolled, absorbing the impact with the ease of a man who had crashed into more planets than he could count. Vegeta landed considerably less gracefully, cratering a section of pavement with a snarl that startled the passing right into an early retirement. The city around them did not look like Earth. It looked almost like Earth, enough that the wrongness of it crawled under the skin before the mind could articulate why. The skyline was a jagged silhouette of black towers and cathedral-sharp spires, lit not by warm streetlight gold, but by a sickly, pulsing violet that seeped from advertisement boards, showing faces twisted into cruel, triumphant smiles. The air smelled of ozone and something else beneath it, an acrid, metallic tang, like a wound that hadn't been allowed to close. Somewhere in the middle distance, sirens wailed, but they wailed in celebration, not warning. A public address system boomed out a jingle whose lyrics, once parsed, revealed themselves to be an advertisement for voluntary indentured servitude, now with flexible terms. Vegeta rose slowly from the crater he'd made, dusting off his gloves, ki already simmering beneath his skin in instinctive readiness. Kakarot, he said low, where in the seven hells are we? Not sure, Goku admitted, scratching the back of his head as he took in the skyline with the open, guileless curiosity of a man who had once wandered into 3 separate universe-ending tournaments by accident and found them all, on some level, interesting. Feels different, though. The air's got a weird taste to it. That, Beerus said, finally deigning to speak, drifting down to hover a few feet above the crack street, is because we are, if my senses are correct, and they're always correct, no longer in your universe at all. Both scions turned to stare at him. A different universe, Beerus continued, examining a claw with theatrical disinterest that fooled neither of them. Adjacent, perhaps, to one I'm vaguely familiar with. There's a rot to this place. Can't you feel it? Everything here has been turned inside out. Where kindness should sit, there's cruelty instead. Where law should sit, there's... He gestured vaguely at a nearby billboard depicting a grinning figure in a black and gold cape crushing a city beneath one boot, the caption reading glory through obedience. That. So we're lost, Vegeta said flatly. We're somewhere new, Goku corrected, already grinning in a way that made Vegeta's eye twitch. Come on, when's the last time that happened? Feels like every fight these days I already know what I'm walking into. This isn't a training exercise, Kakarot. Never said it was. Goku's grin didn't fade, but something sharpened behind his eyes. The same instinct that had once told him, decades and dimensions ago, that a mild-mannered tournament was about to become a battle for the fate of everything. He could feel it now, distantly, like a held breath. Presences out there, in the dark towers, several of them, radiating power signatures that didn't behave like anything from home. Not ki, not quite. Something colder. Something that hummed with a barely restrained wrongness, the same shade of wrong as the streetlights, the same rot Beerus had named without quite defining. Vegeta felt it too, and his scowl deepened, not from fear, but from the particular irritation of a warrior encountering something unfamiliar and being forced, however briefly, to respect it before he could dismiss it. Beerus, notably, felt it and yawned. Interesting, the god of destruction murmured, settling cross-legged in midair, as though he'd found a park bench rather than an alien reality. There's quite a lot of raw power scattered across this city, concentrated, too, a handful of very strong points, and everything else cowering beneath them. He cracked one eye open toward Goku. I imagine that's the sort of thing you'll want to go poke at. Maybe, Goku said, already scanning the skyline with open interest. Do try not to get us all killed doing it, Beerus added, though there was no real concern in his voice, merely the bored condescension of a being who understood, on some fundamental level, that whatever waited in those black towers, however monstrous, however cruel, was not remotely equipped to end a god of destruction's afternoon. He was, however, curious to see it try. Above them, one of the black towers pulsed faintly, a private security algorithm registering 3 anomalous power signatures that defied every known metric in its database, sending an alert racing up through Earth 3's twisted hierarchy toward a mind that specialized, above all things, in knowing things before they happened. Owlman was already awake. He rarely slept, and the numbers scrolling across his monitor, power readings that made Ultraman's own signature look almost quaint, were, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely difficult to explain. He did not smile. Owlman never smiled. But somewhere beneath the mask, a calculation began, cold and precise, already 3 moves ahead of a fight that hadn't started yet. Below, in the ruined street, Goku cracked his knuckles, Vegeta powered up with a low growl of anticipation, and Beerus, still hovering with lazy indifference, allowed himself one small, private thought. This might almost make up for the pudding. The city Owlman had already determined was called Metropolis in whatever twisted mirror this world called history. Though here it wore its name like a joke, its towers built not on hope, but on the bones of 100 smaller uprisings, each one crushed before it could learn to walk. He watched the three anomalies from a rooftop 3 blocks away through a scope that measured more than light, cataloging power output with the detached patience of a man who had built an empire on always knowing more than his enemies. The numbers made no sense. That, more than anything, unsettled him. "Report," came a voice through his earpiece, Ultraman, impatient as always, his baritone carrying the particular arrogance of a being who had never once needed to ask permission to level a building. "3 signatures," Owlman said, voice flat, clipped, betraying nothing. "One reads as background noise compared to the other 2, practically nothing on our scale. The other 2 are," he paused, recalculating, hating that he had to, "considerably above yours." Silence on the line. Then low and dangerous. "That's not possible." "I didn't say it was possible. I said it was what the instruments show." Below, the source of his professional discomfort was currently arguing about pudding. "There has to be something edible in this dump of a reality," Beerus was saying, drifting along the cracked street with the mild, put-upon air of a tourist whose luggage had been lost. "Kakarot, Scout, find me something resembling a bakery." "Lord Beerus, we just got here, and I am already bored of it. Go." Vegeta, for his part, had stopped listening to either of them. His attention locked instead on the black tower 3 blocks distant, where he could feel, faintly, but unmistakably, the press of a gaze. Not a camera, not a machine, something aware, weighing them, calculating. "We're being watched," he said. "Obviously," Beerus replied, unbothered. "Everything in this pathetic little reality watches everything else. That's what rot smells like, Vegeta, a place where no one trusts anyone, because no one has given anyone a reason to." He said it the way another being might comment on weather, an observation, not a judgment, though the faint curl of his lip suggested he found the whole arrangement tediously beneath him. It was at that moment that the street erupted, not with fire, not with sound, with bodies dropping from the rooftops in perfect synchronized formation, black-armored enforcers whose visors glowed the same sickly violet as the city's streetlights. A dozen of them landed in a loose ring around the 3 newcomers, weapons raised, movements crisp with the practiced precision of soldiers who had never once faced resistance worth remembering. "Identify yourselves," barked the lead enforcer, voice distorted through a vocoder. "Unregistered power signatures are property of the syndicate pending processing." Vegeta's eyebrow rose with the specific, dangerous slowness of a man being genuinely amused for the first time in several minutes. "Property," he repeated. "You will comply, or you will be neutralized. This is your only warning." Goku, jogging back from his admittedly brief and fruitless search for a bakery, arrived just in time to take the scene, a dozen armed soldiers, weapons trained on a god and a prince, and utterly, catastrophically unaware of what they'd just cornered. Goku said, raising a hand. "Hey, we don't want any trouble. We just kind of fell here by accident." "Compliance is noted. Processing will begin." One of the enforcers raised a weapon and fired. Not a warning shot, not a stun blast, but a beam of concentrated energy designed, per its schematics, to drop a low-tier metahuman in a single burst. It struck Vegeta squarely in the chest. It did not so much as ruffle his training, GI. The street went quiet in the particular way that only true, dawning horror can produce. The enforcer who'd fired stared at the smoking barrel of his weapon, then at Vegeta, whose expression had shifted from amusement into something colder. The specific, patient contempt of a scion prince who had just been fired upon and found the experience insulting rather than threatening. "My turn," Vegeta said and vanished. What followed was not a battle, so much as an education. Vegeta didn't kill them. Goku's presence beside him ensured that much, a silent, familiar understanding passed between the two scions without a word needing to be exchanged. But he made certain, with brutal surgical efficiency, that every single enforcer in that ring understood precisely how far beneath him they stood. Armor crumpled. Weapons shattered in gauntlet fists before they could fire a second shot. Within 11 seconds, 12 armed soldiers who had, moments before, considered themselves the apex predators of their reality lay groaning in a loose circle of scorched pavement, disarmed, humiliated, and thoroughly disabused of the notion that these newcomers were property of anything. Goku hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't needed to. He'd spent the 11 seconds watching, arms crossed, that same sharp curiosity glinting in his eyes, not at Vegeta's efficiency, which he'd seen 1,000 times, but at the weapons themselves, the strange violet energy discharge, the way it had tried and failed to interact with Ki in any way he recognized. "That's new," he murmured, crouching beside a fallen weapon and turning it over in his hands. "This isn't blaster tech. Feels almost alive." "It's garbage," Vegeta corrected, dusting off his gloves with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd needed to hit something and had just been handed a dozen willing volunteers. Whatever passes for a military in this reality should be ashamed. Above them, forgotten in the chaos, Beerus watched the entire one-sided skirmish with the weary patience of a god who had seen this exact scene play out across 1,000 realities and several thousand tedious afternoons. When it was over, he drifted lower, nudged one groaning enforcer aside with a bare foot, and addressed the group at large in a voice that somehow carried the full, casual weight of cosmic authority without ever rising in volume. "You're going to want to tell whoever sent you," Beerus said, "that the next patrol they send should come with better manners, and ideally, something edible. I am still owed dessert, and my patience for interruptions is," he paused, considering, "thinner than usual, given recent events." The enforcers, to their credit, did not respond. Most of them had passed out from shock rather than injury. The human mind, even here, has limits on how quickly it can process the collapse of its entire understood hierarchy. 3 blocks away, on his rooftop, Owlman watched the feed from a dozen helmet cams go dark, one by one, in 11 seconds flat, and felt, for the first time since he had crossed into this reality and built an empire from its ashes, something that was not quite fear, but stood uncomfortably close to it. "Well," Ultraman's voice, through the earpiece, edged now with something sharper than impatience. "They dismantled a full enforcer squad in under 15 seconds, Owlman said, without sustaining a single injury. The one with the widow's peak," he zoomed the feed, isolating Vegeta's face mid-strike, cataloging the posture, the economy of motion, the sheer contempt in every movement. Fights like he's done this 1,000 times, and finds it beneath him. The taller one barely moved. And the third, his scope drifted to Beerus, still hovering, still lecturing unconscious soldiers about pastries. The third one didn't fight at all. And I don't think he needed to. A long pause on the line. "I want them," Ultraman said finally, and there was a hunger in his voice that Owlman recognized well, because it was the same hunger that had built the syndicate's entire empire. The desire to find the strongest thing in any room and either own it or destroy it, whichever came first. "Bring them to me." "That," Owlman said, watching Vegeta stretch, unbothered, in the wreckage of an entire squad, "may prove more complicated than you're imagining." "I don't care how complicated. Make it happen." Owlman lowered the scope, turning the numbers over once more in his mind. 3 signatures, one negligible by comparison, 2 others that dwarfed even Ultraman's own monstrous ceiling, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the small, private acknowledgement that he did not yet have a plan. He would build one. He always did. But as he watched Beerus float lazily above a dozen unconscious bodies, utterly unconcerned, already complaining about something else entirely, Owlman found himself recalculating a variable he had never before needed to consider in any equation. What do you offer a god who wants nothing you have? Below, unaware of the calculations, churning 3 blocks away, Goku straightened up from his examination of the fallen weapon, tossed it aside, and turned to Vegeta with the easy, restless grin of a man who could already feel a real fight somewhere close. "So," he said, "should we go find whoever sent them?" "Obviously," Vegeta said. "I still want that pudding," Beerus added, from somewhere above them both. The tower they chose belonged, as it turned out, to no one in particular. Or rather, it belonged to everyone who was willing to fight for the privilege of standing at its top, which in Earth 3's peculiar civic architecture amounted to the same thing. It rose from the heart of the district like a black knife stabbed into a bruised sky, its upper floors ringed with the flickering violet glow that seemed to mark every structure of consequence in this rotted mirror of home. They didn't storm it. That had been Vegeta's suggestion, delivered with the enthusiasm of a man who had just discovered a new species of punching bag. But Goku, surprising even himself, had talked him down. "We don't know what's in there," Goku said, studying the tower with an expression more thoughtful than either of his companions was accustomed to seeing on him. Feels like there's a bunch of different power signatures stacked on top of each other. Could be more of those soldier guys. Could be something worse. Let's just look first. Since when do you look first? Vegeta demanded. Since I got the feeling this place doesn't play by the same rules as home, Goku admitted. And something in his voice, quiet, unusually serious, made even Beerus crack an eye open with interest. He wasn't wrong. The rules here were different. And the first of Earth 3's rules to make itself known was that nothing was ever quite what its surface suggested. They found the entrance not stormed but offered, a wide plaza before the tower's base, its ornate doors standing open, guarded by no enforcers at all, which after the morning's display, felt less like an oversight and more like an invitation. Waiting at the top of a short flight of black marble stairs stood a woman in a costume that mirrored unmistakably some hero's iconography twisted into something crueler, a red and blue bodysuit, a cape, an insignia on her chest that might once have stood for hope and now, on her, radiated only menace. Superwoman, she introduced herself, before any of them could ask, arms crossed, expression unreadable behind a confidence so total it bordered on boredom. You're the three who dismantled a syndicate patrol squad without breaking a sweat. That got attention fast. Faster than I've seen in years. You're going to try to stop us too? Vegeta asked, already spoiling for it. Depends what you're here for, Superwoman said, and there was something in the way she said it, a careful neutrality, a woman weighing options rather than following orders. That made Goku's instincts prick up. We're not here for anything, Goku said honestly. We fell in by accident. Kind of a long story. We're just trying to figure out where we are and maybe find our way home. Superwoman studied him for a long moment, head tilted, clearly recalibrating whatever assumption she'd walked down those stairs holding. Huh, she said. That's not what Almond's algorithms predicted. He had you pegged as either conquerors or recruits. Didn't factor in lost tourists. We're not tourists, Vegeta snapped. No, Superwoman agreed, gaze flicking over him with something that might have been respect, might have been calculation. You're something else. I watched the footage. You took a full output disruptor blast to the chest and didn't flinch. Ultraman's the only thing on this planet that shrugs off hits like that, and he'd never let a squad live to tell the story afterward. A pause. That's interesting to some people around here. Dangerous to others. Which are you? Goku asked, disarmingly direct, the way only he ever managed to be. Superwoman almost smiled. Almost. I'm the kind of person who recognizes an opportunity before Owlman finishes calculating it, she said. You want to know where you are? Fine. I'll tell you. This is Earth 3. My Earth. Every hero you might have heard stories about back wherever you're from. We've got their mirror here, and their mirror is worse every single time, because power without conscience always is. Ultraman could crack this planet in half if he felt like it, and he stopped himself exactly 0 times in his life. Almond's the brains, colder than anything you've ever negotiated with. And she spread her hands, indicating the tower, the plaza, the whole rotted skyline beyond. I'm the one who's tired of being the third strongest voice in every room. And you think we're your way to becoming the first, Vegeta said, flat, unimpressed, but not dismissive. I think, Superwoman said, that a god and 2 monsters who can eat a disruptor blast for breakfast are the single greatest variable to fall into this reality in a decade, and I'd rather be the one who befriends you than the one Owlman uses you against. There it was, the first genuine crack of daylight into Earth 3's actual internal architecture, and Goku, ever the strategist beneath his easy grin, filed it away with interest. Not a monolith, he thought. Cracks in the foundation already. Good to know. We're not interested in your politics, Beerus said suddenly, breaking his silence, drifting down the last few feet to stand. Actually stand, boots on stone, an act so rare it made even Superwoman's composure flicker. Before her. I am, however, extremely interested in whether anything in this tower resembles food. Superwoman blinked. Food. Something with layers. Custard, ideally. I was promised a proper dessert before we were rudely interrupted by an entire universe's worth of unnecessary drama. and I have not yet recovered from the disappointment." There was a beat of silence in which Superwoman visibly tried to determine whether the being who had just leveled her assumptions about power, threat, and cosmic hierarchy was joking. She decided, wisely, that it did not matter either way. "I can have something brought up," she said carefully. "Excellent. You may yet prove useful." Vegeta pinched the bridge of his nose. Goku laughed, a real, easy laugh that echoed strangely against the black marble and violet light, utterly foreign to this plaza's history of fear and calculation. And for just a moment, Superwoman's carefully composed expression cracked into something like genuine, startled curiosity. "They're not what anyone expected," she thought, leading them up the stairs, already recalculating her own plans around the unprecedented gift that had just fallen, quite literally, out of the sky. Behind them, unseen, a small drone no larger than an insect peeled away from a shadow of a cornice and streaked off toward a rooftop 3 blocks distant, carrying its recording directly to Owlman, who watched the entire exchange with his jaw set and a 5th, 6th, 7th variable added to an equation that refused to resolve cleanly no matter how he arranged it. Superwoman was already making her move. That, at least, was predictable. She had grown steadily more restless in her position for the better part of 2 years, and the arrival of 3 world-ending anomalies was exactly the kind of destabilizing event she'd been waiting for. What Owlman had not predicted, and what troubled him more than he cared to admit, even to himself, was the god's utter, genuine indifference to the entire power structure he'd spent a decade building. Ultraman wanted them recruited or destroyed. Superwoman wanted them as leverage. But the small purple creature floating amid gods and monsters wanted, as far as Owlman's analysis could determine, desert, and there was no variable in any equation Owlman had ever built for a being who simply did not care about winning. That, Owlman thought, watching the feed go dark as they disappeared into the tower's upper floors, was the single most dangerous thing he had encountered in this or any reality. He began, methodically, to build a new plan. The room Superwoman led them to occupied the tower's 40th floor, a wide, glass-walled chamber that overlooked the whole rotted sprawl of the city below. And it was here, over a spread of food hastily requisitioned from 3 separate districts, that Earth 3 first began to reveal the true shape of its fractures. Beerus, predictably, had claimed the head of a table, and was currently working through what could generously be called a tasting menu with the focused intensity of a scholar parsing an ancient text. "Passable," he pronounced, "of something resembling a custard tart, though the crust suggests whoever baked this has never once considered structural integrity as an artistic principle." He took another bite anyway. Vegeta had not touched the food. He stood instead near the window, arms crossed, radiating the specific impatience of a warrior who considered diplomacy a poor substitute for a good fight, watching Superwoman with the flat, appraising stare of a man cataloging an opponent's weaknesses, whether or not that opponent had yet earned the designation of enemy. "You said Ultraman would want us recruited or destroyed," Goku said, between bites of something that tasted almost, but not quite, like rice. "What about you? What do you actually want?" Superwoman leaned against the table's edge, arms crossed, mirroring Vegeta's posture, without seeming to notice the irony. "I want out from under a hierarchy that only exists because Ultraman happens to punch harder than anyone else on this planet," she said. "That's the whole foundation the syndicate's built on, not loyalty, not shared purpose, just fear of whoever's strongest in the room. Owlman keeps it running because he's smart enough to make himself useful to Ultraman's ego. I keep it running because leaving means dying, and until an hour ago, there wasn't a version of leaving that didn't end that way." "And now?" Goku asked. "Now 3 people fell out of the sky and shrugged off a disruptor blast like it was rain," Superwoman said. "Now there's a version of leaving that maybe doesn't end with me dead." Vegeta's eyes narrowed. "You want us to fight your battles for you. I want you to understand," Superwoman said, "that this reality isn't the united front Owlman likes to present. It's a pyramid held up by threats, and every single person under Ultraman is calculating every single day whether today's the day someone finally topples him. You 3 just became the biggest variable anyone's had in a decade. Everyone in this tower is going to try to use you. I'd rather be honest about that fact than pretend otherwise. It was, Goku thought, a strange kind of honesty, self-serving certainly, but not dishonest, and there was something almost refreshing about a stranger who announced her angle rather than concealing it. He glanced at Vegeta, found the same calculation mirrored on his rival's face, and felt the old, familiar rhythm of shared unspoken agreement pass between them. Watch, don't commit. We're not here to overthrow anybody, Goku said finally. We just want to find a way home. If that means we cross paths with your problems along the way, that's just how it goes sometimes. But we're not your weapon. Something flickered across Superwoman's face, disappointment quickly masked. Fair enough, she said. Though I'd point out that finding a way home from a Rift Owlman doesn't even know the mechanics of yet might take you considerably longer than you're hoping. You might want allies in the meantime, ones who aren't currently deciding whether to weaponize you or dissect you. Dissect, Vegeta repeated, flat. Ultraman's first instinct with anything stronger than him is usually to break it and see what's inside, Superwoman said, without particular emotion, as though describing weather rather than a colleague. He hasn't had reason to worry about anything being stronger than him in longer than anyone here can remember. I'd expect that instinct to kick in fast once he processes what my footage showed him. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, the chamber's far doors slammed open with a percussive crack of displaced air, and Ultraman entered without ceremony, without escort, without a shred of the careful political theater Owlman so favored. Simply a wall of raw, barely restrained power given human shape, eyes glowing faintly red, cape snapping behind him from some self-generated wind. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. So, Ultraman said, voice a low rumble that vibrated the glass walls. Gaze sweeping past Superwoman without acknowledgement and landing, unerringly, on Goku. You're the one who took my squad apart without lifting a finger. That was more him, Goku said, nodding at Vegeta, unbothered by the sheer wall of hostile intent radiating off the man across the room. I just watched. Ultraman's eyes narrowed, some deep, animal part of him recalculating threat assessment on the fly. You watched, he repeated. You're telling me you didn't need to fight. Didn't need to, no. It should have been the wrong thing to say. To a being whose entire identity had been forged in the total absence of equals, the casual admission that a fight hadn't required his opponent's full attention was the deepest possible insult. And Ultraman's fists clenched, knuckles widening, the air around him beginning to shimmer with barely contained heat. I don't like being tested, Ultraman said. Wasn't testing you, Goku said, standing now, easy and unhurried, though every line of his posture had shifted into something more grounded, more ready. But if you want to find out what I can do, I'm not going to stop you asking. The invitation hung in the air, and for a long, dangerous moment, it seemed the 40th floor of Owlman's tower was about to become a crater. Then Beerus, without looking up from his custard tart, spoke. If the two of you are going to do this, the god of destruction said, mildly, please take outside. I am eating, and I find structural collapse extremely disruptive to a good dessert. The sheer, casual absurdity of the interruption did what neither diplomacy nor threat could have. It broke the tension just enough for Ultraman's calculating mind, honed over years of surviving Earth 3's endless internal warfare, to reassert itself over his pride. He did not stand down. Beings like Ultraman never fully stood down. But he took one step back, some fraction of his fury banked, redirected instead toward the small purple figure who had just, with total indifference, treated him as a minor inconvenience to a snack. And what exactly are you? Ultraman demanded. Bored, Beerus said, finally glancing up, eyes half-lidded with the particular weariness of a god forced to explain himself to something so far beneath his notice that the very act felt like a chore. Also a god of destruction. If the title means anything to whatever passes for cosmology in this reality, I'd wager it means considerably less here than it does at home, given the general quality of the pastries. Ultraman opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, found himself entirely without a response. Superwoman, watching from the sidelines with the sharp, assessing focus of a woman recalculating every variable in real time, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. A god, she thought. He called himself a god, and meant it, and Ultraman has no idea what to do with that. Somewhere on a rooftop 3 blocks away, Owlman, who had been monitoring the entire exchange through the tower's internal feed, jaw tight, mind racing, finally allowed himself a single, quiet exhale. He had built an empire on knowing, always, exactly how every confrontation would resolve before it began. For the first time in a decade, he had absolutely no idea. Owlman did not believe in gods. This was not a philosophical position so much as an operational one, a working principle refined over years of dismantling every myth, ideology, and superstition that had ever threatened to interfere with cold, empirical calculation. Gods were what people called things they didn't understand yet. Given enough data, enough time, enough careful dissection, everything eventually reduced to mechanism. Ultraman's strength was biology twisted by radiation exposure. Superwoman's speed was a variant of the same principle. Even the strangest metahuman anomalies on this earth, given sufficient study, always resolved into cause and effect. So when reports came in, Beerus's casual dismissal of Ultraman, the disruptor blast that hadn't so much as wrinkled Vegeta's clothing, Goku's easy, unthreatened confidence in the face of the single most dangerous being on the planet, Owlman did not think God. He thought variable, and variables, however large, could always be solved. He simply needed more data, which was why, less than an hour after the confrontation on the 40th floor, a private, secured elevator delivered a very specific, very careful invitation to the 3 newcomers. A meeting one-on-one, away from Ultraman's volatility and Superwoman's obvious self-interest, framed with the particular diplomatic neutrality that Owlman had spent a decade perfecting. Vegeta, unsurprisingly, wanted no part of it. "It's a trap," he said flatly, as the 3 of them stood in the tower's private observation deck, awaiting whoever had sent the summons. "Probably," Goku agreed, unbothered. "And you're just going to walk into it?" "I mean, yeah." Goku shrugged, grinning. Best way to figure out what someone's planning is usually to let them try it and see what happens. Vegeta made a noise of profound disgust, though he made no move to leave. Beerus, for his part, had settled into a floating cross-legged position near the window, having apparently decided that whatever Owlman wanted to discuss was, at minimum, less interesting than digesting his 4th custard tart, and therefore worth attending purely as background entertainment. Owlman entered without fanfare, no guards, no weapons visible, simply a tall figure in dark, featureless armor, a mask that revealed nothing of the face beneath, moving with the precise, unhurried economy of a man who had long ago concluded that theatrical menace was a waste of energy better spent on actual planning. "I'll be direct," Owlman said, without preamble, taking a position across the room that placed him equidistant from all 3 of them. A subtle, deliberate choice, Goku noted, that suggested a man who had already calculated every possible line of attack and positioned himself to minimize exposure to all of them at once. "You're not from this reality. You arrived through means my instruments still can't fully explain. Your power readings exceed anything on this planet by margins that, frankly, should not be possible according to any physics I'm aware of. I'd like to understand why. Why should we tell you anything?" Vegeta demanded. "Because I'm the only person in this tower who isn't currently trying to either recruit you or use you as a weapon against someone else," Owlman said, with the flat, unbothered honesty of a man entirely confident in his own assessment. "Ultraman wants to break you open and see what's inside. Superwoman wants to ride your power into a coup. I want information. Of the 3 motives on offer, mine is, I'd argue, the least immediately dangerous to your continued well-being." It was, Goku had to admit, a fair point, delivered with a bluntness that felt almost refreshing after Superwoman's careful self-interest and Ultraman's naked aggression. "We're not looking for a fight," Goku said. "We got pulled here by accident. We're trying to find a way back." "A dimensional transit event," Owlman said, already turning the concept over with visible interest. "Fascinating. And unprecedented. As far as my research indicates, Earth 3 has theorized about parallel realities for decades, but an actual physical crossing? That's not supposed to be possible without technology this planet doesn't possess." A pause, calculating. Unless the mechanism wasn't technological at all. Beerus, still floating near the window, cracked one eye open with the air of a being mildly amused at being so accurately, if incompletely, deduced. It wasn't, Beerus said simply. Almond's attention sharpened instantly, the way a predator's does at the first hint of movement in tall grass. Then what was it? Me, Beerus said, with no particular emphasis, as though confessing to having accidentally knocked over a drink rather than torn a hole in the fabric of reality. I was annoyed. Annoyance, in a being of sufficient cosmic standing, occasionally has consequences beyond the merely social. You're saying you tore open a rift between universes, Owlman said slowly, because you were annoyed. I'm saying exactly that, yes. There was a long silence in which Owlman, a man who had spent his entire adult existence building an empire on the careful, methodical understanding of cause and effect, found himself confronting a cause so disproportionate to its effect that his entire framework for understanding power strained audibly at the seams. What are you? Owlman said finally, and it was not delivered as an accusation or a challenge, but as something close to genuine, unguarded curiosity. The first crack Goku noted with interest, in the man's otherwise flawless composure. A god of destruction, Beerus said. Every universe has one, or ought to. Mine is Universe 7. I maintain balance by removing what threatens to overgrow it. It is, on the whole, a rather tedious responsibility, made bearable primarily by good food, which this reality has thus far failed to adequately provide. Owlman turned this information over for a long moment, visibly recalculating every plan he'd built in the past hour around an entirely new and vastly more complicated set of parameters. And if I told you, he said carefully, that Earth 3 has forces that might threaten that balance, would that interest you? Marginally, Beerus said. Continue. There are things in this reality's deeper structure, remnants of the original crisis that birthed this Earth as a mirror of another, that even Ultraman fears to disturb. Antimatter reservoirs, fractures in causality itself, far more unstable than the tear you apparently created by accident. If something in this reality's foundation is already unstable, and you're capable of tearing new rifts through simple frustration, I'd be very interested in understanding just how much collateral risk your continued presence here represents. It was, Goku realized, watching the exchange with growing unease, a carefully constructed pivot, Owlman testing not just Beerus's power, but his patience, probing for the exact pressure points that might turn a bored god into either an ally, or more dangerously, an active threat that could be pointed at someone else. Careful, Vegeta said, low, cutting in for the first time since Owlman's arrival, his voice carrying an edge of warning aimed as much at Beerus's growing interest as at Owlman's calculated fishing. He's trying to make you curious enough to do his work for him. Owlman's masked gaze flicked to Vegeta, unreadable, though something in his posture suggested the observation had landed precisely as intended, not offense, but a kind of cold respect for having been so accurately read. You're not wrong, Owlman admitted, with a particular honesty of a man who found little value in denying an accurate accusation. I am, at all times, trying to find a use for whatever walks through my door. That's not a secret. It's simply how I operate. But that doesn't make the information I've shared any less true. This reality's foundations are unstable. Whatever brought you here disturbed something old. Whether that concerns you, he said, looking back to Beerus, is entirely your own decision to make. Beerus considered this for a long moment, tail flicking with idle thought, before finally shrugging with magnificent indifference. It concerns me exactly as much as everything else here does, he said, which is to say, not particularly, provided it doesn't interfere with my next meal. But I'll admit, you're a more interesting creature than the rest of this rotted little world has produced so far. Careful, calculating, almost respectable for a mortal. It was, Goku suspected, the closest thing to a compliment Owlman was likely to receive in this entire encounter, and the man accepted it with a single measured nod, filing the reaction away alongside every other data point he'd gathered, patience thresholds, motivational levers, the precise flavor of a god's boredom, building, piece by careful piece, toward a plan whose final shape not even he had yet fully determined. But a plan, nonetheless, was forming. And 3 blocks away, in a chamber Owlman had not bothered to fully secure against outside ears, Superwoman listened to the entire exchange through a channel she had quietly, carefully never mentioned to anyone, and began drawing up plans of her own. The unraveling, when it came, began not with violence, but with an offer, which was, Vegeta reflected later, so much worse. Owlman found him alone. It was not an accident. Nothing Owlman did was ever an accident. Vegeta had gathered that much within minutes of their first meeting, and the calculated precision of it grated against him more than any direct threat could have. He'd wanted the tower's lower training levels, partly out of restless irritation, partly because some instinct told him that separating from Goku and Beerus, if only briefly, might draw exactly the kind of approach Owlman was too disciplined to attempt with all three present at once. He was not wrong. "You don't like being here," Owlman said, appearing in the doorway of the training level, with the same unhurried economy that characterized everything he did. "More than the others, I mean." Kakarot seems almost pleased by the novelty. The god finds the whole situation beneath his notice, provided the pastries hold up. "But you," he studied Vegeta for a long moment, cataloging. "You're furious. Not at us. At the situation itself. At being here instead of somewhere that matters." "Careful," Vegeta said low. "I'm not trying to provoke you," Owlman said, which was, of course, precisely the kind of thing a man trying to provoke someone would say, and both of them knew it. "I'm trying to understand you. You fight like someone who's spent a very long time being underestimated and resents every second of it. That's not a guess. That's a pattern I recognize, because it's the same pattern that built this entire tower." It was infuriatingly an accurate read, closer to the bone than Vegeta cared to admit, and the fact that a mortal from an alien reality had managed to identify it within days of meeting him sat like a splinter beneath his pride. "What do you want?" Vegeta said flatly. "A test," Owlman said. "Nothing more. There's a facility 3 districts from here, a research station studying the antimatter fractures I mentioned to your god. It's currently held by a splinter faction that broke from syndicate control 18 months ago. Dangerous people, well-armed, entrenched. Ultraman's avoided cleaning it out because the fighting would be costly even for him, and costly fights aren't worth his time when there's no glory in them. I'd like to know exactly what you're capable of, away from an audience, away from politics. Clear the facility. See what you find. And if I refuse, then I've learned something else about you," Owlman said simply. "Every answer is information, whether you comply or not." It was, Vegeta had to admit, a maddeningly effective approach, one that offered no threat to refuse, no obvious trap to avoid, simply an opportunity dressed as a test, calculated specifically to appeal to a warrior's pride rather than his fear. Refusing felt like conceding something. Agreeing felt like being managed. Both options, Vegeta realized with growing irritation, had been anticipated before Owlman ever opened his mouth. "Fine," Vegeta said, "because in the end, pride always won. I'll clear your facility. Not because you asked. Because I want to see what passes for a real fight in this pathetic reality." Owlman's masked expression revealed nothing, but something in his posture, a fractional easing of tension, suggested satisfaction. "I'll have coordinates sent within the hour," he said, and left without further ceremony. Already 3 calculations ahead of the conversation he'd just concluded. The facility, when Vegeta arrived alone, a choice he made deliberately, unwilling to share whatever this test revealed with an audience, proved considerably more substantial than Owlman's casual description had suggested. It rose from a cratered industrial district like a fortress built by people who expected, correctly, to be attacked eventually. Reinforced walls studded with automated defense turrets, patrol drones weaving overhead in overlapping surveillance patterns, and beneath it all, a low, constant hum of contained energy that Vegeta recognized, with growing interest, as something genuinely unstable. The Splinter Faction's fighters were not the disposable enforcers he'd dismantled in 11 seconds his first day in this reality. These were augmented, bodies reinforced with the same antimatter technology the facility studied, granting them a durability and raw power output that, for the first time since his arrival, actually required Vegeta to work. It was, he privately admitted, exactly what he'd needed. The fight that followed sprawled across 3 levels of reinforced concrete, Vegeta cutting through waves of augmented soldiers with a ferocity that had been building quietly since his arrival in this rotted reality. Every slight, every condescending assumption about his power, every moment of Almond's calculated manipulation, channeled into strikes that left craters where opponents had stood. He did not hold back. There was no reason to. And, in the depths of that fortress, 3 levels down, past the last of the augmented guards, he found the reason Owlman had truly sent him. Not a weapon, not a threat, a child. She couldn't have been more than 10, kept in a containment chamber lined with the same antimatter shielding that powered the facility's defenses. Her small frame connected to a lattice of cables that hummed with barely contained energy. Some kind of experiment, Vegeta realized, a metahuman test subject, harvested for whatever unstable power the Splinter faction had been trying to weaponize, kept alive and conscious and utterly, silently terrified in a cage 3 levels, beneath a war she had no part in. She flinched when she saw him, small body curling in on itself, bracing for whatever violence she'd learned, in this rotted world, to expect from anyone stronger than herself. Vegeta stood in the doorway for a long moment, fists still clenched from the fight above, and felt something shift beneath his fury, something older, something that predated even his arrival in this galaxy of accidents, a memory of another child once told his worth was measured only by his usefulness to those stronger than him. He did not soften. That was not in his nature, and never would be. But he crossed the chamber, tore the containment cables free with a single sharp motion, and did not raise his voice when he spoke. "Can you walk?" The girl stared at him, uncomprehending, as though violence without cruelty was a language she'd never been taught. "I said," Vegeta repeated, "can you walk?" She nodded slowly, and he turned without another word, expecting her to follow. And she did, trailing behind him through the wreckage of the facility he'd just torn apart, past the bodies of augmented soldiers who would, eventually, recover from injuries considerably more merciful than Vegeta's usual standard, out into daylight that this rotted reality still, somehow, managed to produce. It was not until he'd delivered her, wordlessly, without ceremony, into Superwoman's custody at the tower's base, refusing every question about what he'd found or why he bothered, that Vegeta allowed himself to acknowledge privately exactly what Owlman's test had actually measured. Not his power. Owlman had known his power already, roughly, from the footage of the Enforcer Squad. He'd wanted to know what Vegeta would do with a captive who couldn't fight back. Whether the Scion Prince's fury translated into cruelty, or stopped somewhere short it. 3 blocks away, reviewing the drone footage of the entire encounter with the same cold, careful attention he gave everything, Owlman found the answer more useful than he'd anticipated, and considerably more complicated than the ruthless mercenary he'd hoped to catalog. He has a line, Owlman thought, watching Vegeta's retreating back on the monitor, already recalculating. Asterisk, that's useful. That's also a lever, asterisk. He began, with the same patient precision that had built an empire from a rotted world's ashes, to consider exactly how a man's unexpected mercy might be turned, eventually, into his greatest vulnerability. Beerus had, by the 3rd day in this rotted reality, exhausted every reasonably palatable food source within a 12-block radius of Owlman's tower, and had begun, with the particular single-minded focus of a god denied his simple pleasures, expanding his search considerably further afield. This was, in retrospect, precisely the opening Superwoman had been waiting for. "There's a market district 2 miles east," she said, appearing at his elbow with the practiced casualness of someone who had clearly planned the encounter down to the minute. "Independent traders, mostly outside syndicate jurisdiction. Word is they've got imports from 3 other sectors. Might have something that actually meets your standards." Beerus regarded her with the particular half-lidded suspicion of a being who had lived several eternities and recognized a transaction disguised as generosity when he saw one. "And you're offering to guide me there out of the goodness of your heart." "I'm offering," Superwoman said, "because a god who owes me a favor is worth considerably more than a market's worth of pastries." "Ah." Beerus's tail flicked, mildly amused despite himself. "At least you're honest about the price." "Very well. Let on. But understand, I am not purchased so cheaply as a meal. I am, at most, inclined to listen, which is a distinction you would be wise to remember. The market district, when they arrived, proved a genuine surprise. A sprawling, chaotic tangle of stalls and vendors operating in the shadow of the syndicate's towers, but conspicuously outside their direct control, a patchwork economy of smugglers, independent traders, and refugees from a dozen crushed uprisings, all held together by the simple, universal principle that even tyranny needs somewhere for its subjects to buy bread. Beerus found, to his genuine and vocal delight, an imported confection from some distant sector that approximated custard closely enough to earn something close to his approval, and for a time walked the market's winding rows in a state of rare, unguarded contentment. It was there, amid stalls selling salvage tech and black market rations, that Superwoman finally made her actual pitch. "You could end this," she said quietly, as Beerus sampled a third pastry with theatrical consideration. "The whole syndicate. Ultraman's tyranny, Almond's manipulations, all of it. You said it yourself. You're a god. One who tears holes in reality when he's merely annoyed. Imagine what you could do if you actually tried." "Imagine," Beerus agreed, unbothered, "and then imagine why I would bother." "Because it's wrong," Superwoman said. "Because people are suffering under it. Because morality is a mortal indulgence," Beerus interrupted, not unkindly, though there was an edge beneath the words that made even Superwoman pause. "I did not travel here to right your reality's wrongs, girl. I am not a hero. I am not, contrary to whatever framework your world insists on imposing upon every powerful being it encounters, obligated to intervene in every injustice I happen to witness. Do you understand how many realities exist? How many tyrannies? How many crushed rebellions? How many small cruelties multiply across the endless multiverse in any given moment? If I involved myself in each one, I would have no time remaining for anything else. Certainly not dessert." "So you'll just let it continue," Superwoman said, and there was real frustration in it now, the practiced diplomacy cracking at the edges. "Because it's inconvenient." "I did not say that," Beerus replied, and something in his tone shifted, subtly, from lazy indifference toward something more precise, more genuinely considered. "I said it is not my obligation. Whether Kakarot involves himself is an entirely separate question, and I suspect you already know the answer, given how he spent the last 3 days." It was, Superwoman realized with a start, an accurate observation. Goku had spent every hour since their arrival not lounging in the tower's comforts, but wandering the lower districts, asking questions, meeting people, absorbing the shape of this rotted world's suffering with the same open, restless curiosity he brought to everything else. She'd noted it, filed it away, as harmless wandering. She had not, until this moment, considered what it might be building toward. "He'll fight for what he believes is right," Beerus continued, sampling another pastry with renewed interest, not because a god commands it, but because that is simply the shape of him. "Has been, since long before I knew him. Vegeta will fight for his own reasons, which are considerably more complicated and considerably less noble, though the results tend toward the same outcome regardless. But he gestured at himself with idle self-satisfaction. "I fight when something threatens balance on a scale that actually concerns me. Your syndicate's cruelty, however genuine, does not yet rise to that threshold." "Yet," Superwoman repeated, catching the qualifier. "Yet," Beerus agreed, something sharp glinting behind the half-lidded eyes. "Owlman mentioned instabilities in this reality's foundation. Antimatter fractures, remnants of whatever cosmic accident birthed this mirror world in the first place. If those instabilities grow severe enough to threaten something beyond your own petty political struggles, if they begin to threaten my universe through the rift I so carelessly created, then you may find my indifference considerably less absolute than it currently appears." Superwoman turned this new information over carefully, recalculating, the way she recalculated everything in this endless internal war of angles and leverage. A god who wouldn't fight for justice, but might fight to prevent a genuine cosmic threat. That was a different lever entirely, one she filed away with the same careful precision Owlman himself might have applied. "Then maybe," she said slowly, "the instabilities are worth more attention than anyone in the syndicate has been giving them." "Perhaps," Beerus said, Or perhaps your own tyrant is deliberately ignoring them, because addressing them would require admitting weakness. And admitting weakness is not a language your Ultraman speaks fluently. It was a barbed observation, delivered with casual precision, and Superwoman found herself, against every careful instinct she'd cultivated over years of surviving Earth-3's endless calculations, genuinely startled by how accurately it landed. "You've been here 3 days," she said, "and you already understand him better than most of the syndicate does." "I have existed considerably longer than 3 days," Beerus said, finishing the last of his pastry with evident satisfaction. "And tyrants, in my experience, are remarkably similar across every reality I've had the misfortune of observing. Fear of weakness, hunger for a strength that can never be challenged. Your Ultraman is not unique. He is simply the loudest example your particular corner of the multiverse happened to produce." They walked in silence for a time after that, through market stalls that carried on their business, unaware that the conversation passing through their midst carried implications for the fate of their entire world. And Superwoman found herself, for the first time since this entire encounter began, genuinely uncertain what outcome she was actually working toward. She had wanted a weapon. What she'd found, instead, was something far stranger. A god who judged her entire reality's suffering by a standard that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with cosmic balance. A scale she barely understood and could not, by any means she currently possessed, hope to influence. Maybe, she thought, watching Beerus drift ahead of her, already eyeing another stall's wares with renewed interest. Asterisk, the instabilities are exactly the lever I need. Not to move a god's conscience, to move his convenience. Asterisk. It was, she reflected, a far colder calculation than the one she'd walked into this market intending to make, and considerably closer, though she did not yet realize it, to the exact kind of thinking that had built Owlman's entire empire in the first place. Word of the augmented facility's destruction reached Ultraman within the hour, and with it came a report that irritated him considerably more than the facility's loss itself. Owlman had sent one of the newcomers on an unsanctioned mission, without consulting him first. "You went around me," Ultraman said, finding Owlman in his usual perch overlooking the city, voice carrying the low, dangerous rumble of a man unaccustomed to being excluded from decisions within his own domain. "I ran a test," Owlman corrected, not looking up from his monitors. The Splinter Faction's facility was a liability regardless of who cleared it. "I simply arranged for the clearing to also generate useful data." "And what did you learn?" "That the one called Vegeta has more restraint than his temperament suggests," Owlman said. "He found a captive test subject in the facility's depths, and chose to extract her rather than leave her to die in the crossfire. That's not the profile of a mindless weapon. That's a man operating according to a code, however buried beneath his pride." Ultraman's jaw tightened. "A code is a weakness. A code is a lever," Owlman corrected. "There's a distinction, and I'd advise you learn it before this situation escalates further than either of us can control." It was, in the tangled hierarchy of Earth-3's syndicate, a genuinely unusual moment. Owlman, who had spent a decade carefully managing Ultraman's ego rather than directly contradicting it, now speaking with the flat, unvarnished honesty of a man who had, for the first time, encountered variables large enough to make careful political theater feel like an indulgence he could no longer afford. Ultraman heard it too, and did not like what it implied. "You're afraid of them," he said. "I'm cautious of them," Owlman said. "There's a distinction there as well, though I understand it may be a difficult one for you to appreciate." The insult landed exactly as calculated, precise, deniable, and sharp enough to remind Ultraman, without ever directly saying so, that brute strength had limits that careful strategy did not. Ultraman's hands clenched at his sides, restrained fury radiating off him in waves that made the reinforced glass of the observation deck hum faintly with sympathetic vibration. "Then what do you suggest?" Ultraman said through gritted teeth, "since you clearly believe strength alone won't resolve this." Owlman finally turned from his monitors, regarding the syndicate's strongest member with the same cold. Assessing patience, he applied to every problem that crossed his desk. "I suggest," he said, "that we find out what they actually want and offer it to them, before they decide to take it by force instead. Kakarot wants a way home. That's a genuine, exploitable need. one that requires precisely the kind of resources this syndicate controls. Granted carefully, in exchange for their cooperation. And we gain 3 of the most powerful beings this reality has ever encountered, at a fraction of the cost that trying to break them by force would demand. And if they refuse the arrangement once we've helped them, then we've lost nothing we didn't already lack, Owlman said, and gained considerable data on exactly how they operate under negotiation rather than conflict. Either outcome serves us. The only outcome that doesn't is provoking a fight none of us can guarantee we'd win. It was, Ultraman had to grudgingly admit, the kind of reasoning that had kept the Syndicate's hierarchy stable for a decade despite his own volatile impulses. Cold, patient, calculating every angle before committing to any single path. He hated how often Owlman was right. He hated it more, in this particular case, because being right meant admitting, however indirectly, that brute force alone would not settle this. Fine, Ultraman said finally. Make the offer. But if they refuse it? If they refuse it, Owlman said, we'll have learned something considerably more valuable than a facility's worth of augmented soldiers, and we'll adjust accordingly. The offer, when it came, was delivered not by Owlman himself, but through Superwoman. A deliberate choice. Goku suspected the moment she approached, meant to soften an inherently transactional proposal with a face the newcomers had already come to trust, however cautiously. Owlman's willing to dedicate research resources toward understanding your rift, she said. Finding Goku and Vegeta together on the tower's training level, Beerus notably absent, still working through the market district's remaining stalls with unhurried thoroughness. Full access to Earth-3's antimatter research, the same technology that powers the fractures Owlman mentioned. If the mechanism that brought you here has any connection to that instability, and given what happened with Beerus, it very well might, that research could be your fastest path home. In exchange for what? Vegeta asked, already suspicious. Cooperation, Superwoman said. Nothing specific yet. Just a willingness to work with the Syndicate rather than against it, while the research continues. Ultraman wants assurance you're not planning to tear his empire apart out of boredom. Owlman wants data. I want, she paused, and for once, something like genuine uncertainty flickered across her composed features. I honestly don't know anymore what I want, watching all of this unfold. Goku considered the offer carefully, turning it over with more deliberation than his usual easy nature typically allowed. A way home's worth a lot, he admitted. But I'm not going to promise cooperation with people who dissect kids in secret labs and call it research. That facility wasn't sanctioned syndicate research, Superwoman said. It was a splinter faction Ultraman's been too lazy to clean out. I'm not defending it. Maybe not, Goku said, but it's still what this whole system produces, isn't it? Whether it's sanctioned or not. He met her eyes, steady, unflinching, none of his usual easy humor present in the moment. I'll think about the research offer. I want to get home, that part's true. But I'm not going to trade that for helping keep people scared of a tyrant, even by accident. It was, Superwoman realized, exactly the kind of complication Owlman's careful calculations hadn't fully accounted for. A variable who wanted the practical benefit of cooperation without accepting the moral compromise that cooperation implied. A distinction that felt, to her calculating instincts, almost naively idealistic. And yet, watching the quiet, unshakable conviction in Goku's expression, she found herself, against every careful political instinct she'd cultivated, almost envying it. I'll relay that, she said finally, though I suspect Owlman won't find the distinction as meaningful as you do. Maybe not, Goku agreed, but it's the only offer I've got. Vegeta, watching the exchange in silence, said nothing, though privately, he found himself considering, for the first time since their arrival, whether Kakarot's stubborn insistence on drawing lines, even in an alien reality's rotted politics, might prove more useful, in the end, than his own instinct to simply fight whatever stood in front of him. The negotiation, unresolved, hung over the tower like the first genuine crack in Owlman's careful plans, a variable that refused to resolve as cleanly as every equation he'd ever built before it. The rift, when Owlman's scientists finally located and stabilized a reading on it, proved considerably more complicated than anyone in the tower had anticipated. And its complications, unfortunately, arrived precisely when Ultraman's patience had finally, irrevocably run out. 3 days, Ultraman said, pacing the observation deck with barely restrained agitation. 3 days of research, negotiation, careful diplomatic theater. And what have we gained? A partial cooperation from one of them, contemptuous silence from the other. And a god who spends his afternoons buying pastries in the market district, like this entire situation, is beneath his notice. Patience produces better outcomes than force historically, Owlman said, not looking up from the readings scrolling across his monitor. Patience is what weak men call cowardice, Ultraman snapped, and something in his tone made even Owlman finally glance up, recognizing the particular quality of a man's restraint finally reaching its breaking point. I built this empire by taking what I wanted the moment I wanted it. I didn't negotiate with the Justice League's counterparts across the multiverse. I didn't offer them research access and careful diplomatic theater. I broke them, and everyone who might have challenged me since has understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly what happens to those who try. These aren't the Justice League's counterparts, Owlman said carefully. I'd remind you again that the power differential here is unlike anything. I don't care about the differential, Ultraman said, and there was something in his voice now that made the reinforced glass of the observation deck hum with sympathetic vibration, an old animal fury, finally breaking free of whatever careful restraint Owlman's council had imposed on it. I am the strongest thing this planet has ever produced. I did not become that by accepting limits other men set for me. If they won't submit to negotiation, I'll find out exactly what it takes to break them. The same way I've broken every other obstacle this Earth has thrown at me. That's precisely the outcome I've been trying to avoid, Owlman said. But Ultraman was already moving, already gone. The observation deck's reinforced doors buckling slightly under the sheer force of his exit. And Owlman found himself, for the second time in this entire encounter, in the deeply unfamiliar position of having his careful calculations overridden by someone else's impatience. He activated the tower's internal comms immediately. Superwoman, Ultraman's moving. I need eyes on Kakarot's location, now. Goku felt it before Superwoman's warning ever reached him, a pressure building in the air. The same wrongness he'd sensed on their first day in this reality. Now concentrated, focused, moving directly toward the training level with unmistakable, escalating intent. Vegeta, he said, already rising from where he'd been sparring lightly against the level's reinforced equipment, testing the give of Earth 3's strange, dense metals against Psion strength. Something's coming. I feel it, Vegeta said, already turning, already settling into a ready stance, some old, familiar instinct sharpening beneath his irritation. Finally, a real fight. Ultraman arrived not through a door, but through the ceiling itself, crashing down through 3 reinforced floors in a single, contemptuous demonstration of exactly how little this tower's structural integrity meant to him, landing in the training level center with a shockwave that cracked the reinforced floor in a spiderweb radius beneath his boots. I'm done waiting, Ultraman said, eyes glowing with barely restrained heat, fists already clenched. You want to stay in my reality. You submit to my authority, or I find out exactly what it takes to make you. We told you, Goku said, settling into an easy, unbothered stance that belied the sharp readiness beneath it. We're not here to challenge your authority. We just want to go home. Then prove it, Ultraman said. Kneel. The word hung in the air, and Goku felt Vegeta's fury spike beside him. Not fear, never fear, but the old, familiar outrage of a prince asked to submit, a wound that predated even his arrival in this rotted reality, stretching back to years of servitude under a tyrant considerably crueler than the one currently demanding his submission. I don't kneel, Vegeta said, low, dangerous, to anyone. Then you'll kneel anyway, Ultraman said, once I'm done. He moved first, a blow that would have leveled a city block, aimed squarely at Vegeta's chest, delivered with the full, contemptuous force of a being who had never once, in his entire violent existence, needed to hold anything back. Vegeta caught it on a raised forearm, and the shockwave that followed cracked the training level's reinforced walls, sent equipment scattering, blew out the observation windows in a shower of glass that rained down across the plaza 40 floors below, and Vegeta, arm trembling slightly from the sheer force of the impact, but otherwise entirely unbroken, met Ultraman's stunned gaze with a slow, dangerous smile. "That's more like it," Vegeta said. What followed was not the one-sided demonstration Ultraman had anticipated, nor the effortless victory Vegeta had privately hoped for. It was, instead, a genuine, escalating exchange, blow meeting blow with a ferocity that tested both fighters in ways neither had experienced in longer than either cared to admit. Ultraman's raw, undisciplined power met Vegeta's honed, battle-forged technique in a collision that shattered every remaining structure on the training level within the first 30 seconds. The two combatants, moving faster than the tower's automated systems could even register, trading strikes that would have leveled mountains on either of their homeworlds. Goku watched, arms crossed, resisting every instinct to intervene. This was Vegeta's fight, earned and wanted, and interrupting it would have been its own kind of insult. But as the exchange stretched past the first minute, past the second, Goku's trained eye caught something Vegeta himself, lost in the pure cathartic release of a genuine challenge, hadn't yet registered. Ultraman's punches, wild and undisciplined as they were, carried an undertone of something darker than simple rage, a barely restrained hunger to actually, permanently end this fight, consequences be damned. Pride overriding every calculation Owlman had spent the last 3 days carefully constructing. This was no longer a test. This was a tyrant, finally unleashed, no longer interested in negotiation, recruitment, or careful diplomatic theater, interested only in proving, through violence, that his reality's hierarchy remained unbroken. And somewhere in the tower's depths, Owlman watched the entire collision unfold on a dozen monitors, recalculating. Because for the first time since this entire encounter began, the variable he'd spent 3 careful days trying to manage had just torn itself entirely free of his control. The fight had, by the 3rd minute, stopped being contained to the training level at all. Ultraman's fury, unmoored now from any pretense of controlled demonstration, had driven the collision downward through 4 more floors of reinforced tower architecture, each impact peeling back concrete and steel like wet paper, until the two combatants tumbled out into the plaza below in a shower of debris that sent Owlman's remaining security personnel scattering for cover. Vegeta rode the momentum of a devastating haymaker into the plaza's black marble, cratering the stone in a radius that swallowed 3 parked transport vehicles, and rose from the impact with blood at his lip and a grin that had nothing sane behind it. "Is that everything?" Vegeta called, voice carrying across the ruined plaza with genuine, contemptuous delight. "Because I fought harder against training drones." It was, of course, a lie. Ultraman's raw power, unleashed fully for the first time, had tested Vegeta more than he'd expected, more than he'd admit aloud even under torture. But pride was pride, and provoking a tyrant already unmoored from restraint seemed, in the moment, considerably more interesting than de-escalating him. Ultraman roared and came again. Above the plaza, on the tower's exterior, Goku watched the fight spill downward with growing concern, not for Vegeta's safety, which he trusted implicitly, but for the mounting collateral devastation, the civilians fleeing the plaza's edges, the exact kind of consequence-blind escalation that could, if left unchecked, spiral into something considerably worse than a personal grudge match. "Vegeta," he called down, "maybe wrap this up before half the city's gone." He started it. Vegeta shot back, ducking beneath a strike that cratered the pavement where he'd stood a half-second before, retaliating with a combination that sent Ultraman skidding backward through a stone fountain. "I'm simply finishing it." The trouble, Goku realized, watching the exchange with mounting unease, was that neither fighter seemed genuinely interested in finishing anything. Vegeta's pride demanded the fight continue until Ultraman's submission was total and undeniable, while Ultraman's fury, now entirely divorced from strategy, seemed determined to keep fighting regardless of the mounting damage to his own city, his own authority, his own carefully constructed image of invincibility. It was Superwoman, arriving at a dead sprint from the tower's evacuated lower levels, who finally articulated what Goku had already begun to suspect. "He won't stop," she said, breathless, watching the plaza's continued destruction with something close to genuine alarm. Not because he thinks he can win, because losing publicly in front of half the district, that's not a defeat he can survive politically. Every faction in the syndicate who's ever resented his authority is watching this right now. If he backs down, if he's seen losing and walking away from it, his entire hierarchy collapses within the week. So he'd rather die than lose in public, Goku said, grim understanding dawning. He'd rather destroy half the city than lose in public, Superwoman corrected. There's a difference, and it's considerably worse. Below, the fight had escalated further still. Ultraman, bleeding now from a cut above his eye, driving Vegeta backward through the plaza's remaining structures with a barrage of blows that carried, beneath their raw force, the unmistakable desperation of a man who understood, on some buried level, that he was losing and could not afford to. I need you to stop this, Superwoman said, turning to Goku with something close to genuine urgency, before it stops being about pride and starts being about actual survival. Ultraman doesn't have an off switch once he's this far gone. I've seen it before. It ends with him dead, or it ends with the city in ruins. There's no version where it just stops. Goku considered this for a long moment, weighing Vegeta's pride against the mounting collateral cost, and made a decision that, 3 days into this rotted reality, felt less like an intervention and more like the exact kind of moral line he'd already promised himself he wouldn't cross for anyone's convenience. Vegeta, he called down, voice carrying an authority that cut cleanly through the plaza's chaos. That's enough. Vegeta, catching Ultraman's next strike on a raised forearm, glanced up with genuine irritation. I'm busy, Kakarot. I know. I'm ending it anyway. Goku dropped from the tower's exterior in a controlled fall that ended, with casual understated precision, directly between the two combatants, not blocking either of them, not threatening either of them, simply present, in a way that made both fighters instinctively pause. Move, Ultraman snarled, chest heaving, blood dripping from his brow. No, Goku said simply, without heat, without provocation, just a flat, immovable refusal that carried, beneath its calm surface, the full weight of everything Ultraman had already witnessed and utterly failed to comprehend about the man standing before him. You've made your point. Vegeta's made his. This ends here, before more of your city gets wrecked over something that's already settled. Nothing settled, Ultraman said, until one of us can't get up. That's not going to happen today, Goku said, and something in his voice, quiet, absolute, entirely without doubt, landed with more force than any blow either combatant had thrown in the last 4 minutes. I'm not going to fight you. Not because I'm afraid to. Because I don't think it'll actually solve whatever's really bothering you. And I think you already know that too, somewhere underneath all this. It was, Superwoman realized, watching from the tower's ruined edge, an almost impossible thing to witness. A being of genuine, casual, godlike power choosing, deliberately, not to escalate a confrontation he could clearly win, not out of weakness, but out of some deeper conviction that violence, however available, wasn't always the answer worth reaching for. Ultraman stared at Goku for a long, charged moment, chest still heaving, pride and fury warring visibly across his features. And then slowly, unmistakably, something in his posture broke. Not defeat. Something quieter, more complicated. The recognition, however unwelcome, that he had just been shown a kind of strength his entire violent philosophy had never once accounted for. He said nothing. He simply turned, wordlessly, and walked back toward the tower's ruined entrance, leaving the plaza's wreckage and his own bleeding pride behind him. Vegeta, watching him go, turned to Goku with an expression caught somewhere between irritation and grudging respect. You didn't need to do that. Maybe not, Goku admitted, but I think it needed doing anyway. Above them, on a rooftop overlooking the entire ruined plaza, Owlman watched the confrontation's resolution with a particular, unsettled focus of a man who had just witnessed something his careful calculations had never once predicted. A being with more raw power than his entire syndicate combined, choosing restraint not from fear, but from principle. And somewhere in that realization, Owlman felt the first genuine crack in his decade-long conviction that every problem, given enough patience, eventually reduced to a solvable equation. Not everything reduces, he thought, watching Goku help Superwoman clear debris from the plaza's edge with the same easy, unbothered generosity he brought to everything else. Some variables simply refuse. The plaza's destruction, once the immediate crisis passed, left behind a political fracture that spread through the syndicate's hierarchy faster than any of Almond's careful calculations had anticipated. Word traveled quickly in a system built entirely on fear of the strongest voice in the room. Ultraman had fought and lost, not through direct defeat, but through something arguably worse, a public demonstration that he could be stopped, contained, refused by a being who hadn't even needed to throw a punch to do it. In a hierarchy built on the simple, brutal logic of raw power, the revelation that something existed capable of casually overriding Ultraman's will without violence sent tremors through every faction that had ever quietly resented his rule. Superwoman felt it first, in the subtle shift of loyalty among the tower's mid-tier enforcers, several of whom found reasons to seek her counsel rather than report directly through Ultraman's usual channels. Owlman felt it in the careful, probing questions from syndicate financiers who had, until now, never once considered challenging the established order. And Deathstorm, the syndicate's nuclear-powered enforcer, a being of contained atomic fury who had, until this point, remained largely on the periphery of the unfolding crisis, felt it as an opportunity too rare to ignore. Ultraman's weak, Deathstorm said, cornering Owlman in a hastily repaired section of the tower's mid-levels, his form flickering with barely contained radioactive instability. And everyone in this building knows it now. You should have let me handle the newcomers from the start. I don't negotiate. I don't test. I simply burn through whatever's in front of me until there's nothing left to resist. Your approach has a 90% probability of ending in catastrophic citywide radiation exposure, Owlman said, without looking up from his monitors. I've run the models. They're not favorable. Your models didn't account for a scion tearing through a plaza either, Deathstorm shot back. And yet here we are. It was, Owlman had to concede, a fair point, and one that troubled him considerably more than he let show. His careful, methodical approach, patience, negotiation, calculated leverage, had produced exactly one tangible result in 3 days. Ultraman's humiliation, a fractured hierarchy, and 3 anomalies who remained, despite every angle he tried, stubbornly outside his ability to fully predict or control. If Ultraman's authority is genuinely compromised, Owlman said slowly, turning the variable over with the same cold precision he applied to everything, then perhaps the more productive question isn't how to bring the newcomers to heel. Perhaps it's how to ensure this syndicate survives the transition to whatever comes next. Meaning what? Deathstorm demanded. Meaning I've spent a decade managing Ultraman's ego, because his raw power made him the most efficient tool for maintaining order, Owlman said. If that calculation no longer holds, if his authority is genuinely broken, then loyalty to him specifically becomes a liability rather than an asset. I didn't build this syndicate to serve one man's pride. I built it to maintain control. Those aren't always the same objective. Deathstorm's flickering form stilled, processing the implication. You're talking about replacing him. I'm talking, Owlman said carefully, about ensuring the syndicate's survival regardless of who sits at its head. Whether that's Ultraman, reformed and humbled by recent events, or someone else entirely, is a question I haven't yet answered. But I'd be a poor strategist if I didn't at least consider the alternative. It was in the tangled, backstabbing ecosystem of Earth-3's power structures, precisely the kind of quiet, careful betrayal that had toppled empires before, not through open rebellion, but through the slow, deliberate recalculation of loyalty by the one man whose support Ultraman had always assumed was unconditional. Deathstorm left the conversation with considerably more to consider than he'd arrived with, and Owlman, alone once more with his monitors, allowed himself a rare moment of genuine uncertainty, not about the newcomers, whose variables remained frustratingly unpredictable, but about his own empire's foundations, which he now recognized, for the first time in a decade, as considerably less stable than he'd allowed himself to believe. Vegeta, meanwhile, had sought out Goku on the tower's upper observation deck, working through the aftermath of the plaza fight with the particular restless energy of a warrior who'd been denied a clean resolution. You made me look weak, Vegeta said, without preamble, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the ruined plaza below. I made you look like someone who didn't need to prove anything else, Goku corrected. There's a difference. Is there? You beat him, Vegeta. You beat him fair, and everyone in that plaza saw it. I just made sure it didn't turn into something neither of us could walk back from." Goku leaned against the deck's railing, expression more serious than his usual easy grin allowed. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just don't think burning down half this city was worth whatever point you were trying to prove." Vegeta was quiet for a long moment, old pride warring against a grudging, unwelcome recognition that Goku's read of the situation had been infuriatingly correct. "This place is rotten," he said finally, changing tack, gesturing at the skyline beyond the deck's edge. "Every faction here operates on fear and leverage. That girl in the facility, she's not the only one. There are probably thousands like her scattered across this city, kept in line by exactly the kind of hierarchy we just watched crack in that plaza." "I know," Goku said quietly. "So what are we actually doing here?" Kaku wrote. "Beerus wants pastries. You want to avoid stepping on anyone's morals. I want a real fight. None of that actually changes anything for the people stuck living under this syndicate's boot." It was, Goku recognized, the closest Vegeta had come since their arrival to voicing something that sounded almost like genuine concern for people who weren't himself, buried, as always, beneath pride and deflection, but present nonetheless. "Maybe it doesn't have to stay that way," Goku said slowly, an idea forming, still rough-edged and unfinished. "We didn't come here to fix this reality. But now that we're here, now that Ultraman's authority is already cracking on its own, maybe there's a way to make sure whatever comes next is actually better than what came before." Vegeta studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You're talking about actually getting involved. Properly. Not just refusing fights and hoping the dominoes fall the right way." "Maybe," Goku admitted. "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I think we might not have much choice the way things are cracking apart around here." Below them, in the tower's depths, Owlman continued his careful recalculations, and across the fractured districts of Earth 3, factions long suppressed by fear of Ultraman's raw power began, quietly, to consider the previously unthinkable, that the hierarchy holding their entire world together might, for the first time in a decade, actually be breakable. Beerus felt the shift in this reality's fabric 3 days before anyone else noticed it, and he felt it not as an idea or a suspicion, but as a physical wrongness pressing against his divine senses. The same quality of wrought heat detected on their first afternoon here, now sharpening, concentrating, building towards something his ancient instincts recognized immediately as dangerous on a scale that finally, genuinely warranted his attention. He found Owlman on the tower's research level, poring over readings from the antimatter facility with an intensity that suggested the strategist, too, had begun sensing something troubling in his own data. "Your instabilities are worse than you've told anyone," Beerus said, without preamble, drifting into the research chamber with none of his usual lazy indifference. Owlman looked up, and for the first time since their arrival, something like genuine alarm flickered behind his otherwise impenetrable composure. "You can sense it too. I can sense a fracture in your reality's foundation widening at a rate that suggests it will breach containment within days, not months," Beerus said. "I assumed, given your posturing about careful research and measured caution, that you had this considerably more under control." "We did," Owlman said, turning back to his monitors with barely restrained urgency, pulling up readings that painted a picture considerably more alarming than anything he'd previously shared. "The antimatter reservoirs beneath this city are remnants of the cosmic event that created Earth 3 as a mirror reality in the first place. Ancient, contained, theoretically stable indefinitely. But your rift, when it opened, didn't just create a passage between universes. It disturbed something in the containment fields holding those reservoirs stable. I've been tracking the degradation for 2 days, hoping it would plateau." "And has it?" "No," Owlman admitted. "It's accelerating." Beerus's tail lashed with sharp, genuine irritation, not at Owlman, but at the situation itself, at the tedious, familiar reality of a god's carelessness producing consequences that now demanded his direct, personal attention regardless of how thoroughly he'd hoped to avoid it. "How long," he said, "before it breaches? At current rates? 4 days. Perhaps 5. Owlman met his gaze directly, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through his careful composure. If those reservoirs destabilize fully, the resulting antimatter cascade won't just devastate the city. It could tear through the fabric of this entire reality, and given the nature of the rift you created, potentially propagate through to your universe as well. There it was, the exact threshold Beerus had warned Superwoman about in the market district, the precise circumstance under which his indifference would finally, genuinely break. A threat not merely to Earth 3's rotted politics, but to the cosmic balance he existed, fundamentally, to protect. Then this is no longer your problem alone, Beerus said, voice dropping into something colder, more absolute than anything he'd allowed himself to display since their arrival. This is now mine. Owlman studied him for a long moment, recalculating rapidly, recognizing in the god's shifted demeanor the arrival of exactly the variable he'd hoped, 3 days ago, to somehow leverage to his advantage, except now arriving not as a bargaining chip he controlled, but as an independent force with motivations of its own, converging, for once, with his own desperate need for a solution. What do you require? Owlman said. To stabilize it. Access to the reservoirs directly, Beerus said. And every scrap of data your research has gathered on their structure. I will need to understand precisely what I'm containing before I attempt it. I can have you there, within the hour. Do so, Beerus said, and pray, for your rotted reality's sake, that my instincts about the required correction prove accurate. I am considerably better at destruction than preservation, and this task demands the opposite of my natural inclination. Goku and Vegeta arrived at the reservoir site, a vast, cavernous facility buried beneath the city's oldest district, its walls lined with the same violet-tinged energy that seemed to define Earth 3's every dark corner. To find Beerus already suspended above a churning, unstable well of antimatter energy that pulsed with a wrongness even their own senses could detect from the facility's entrance. This is worse than I expected, Beerus said, without turning, his attention fixed entirely on the roiling energy below him. The containment fields are failing in a cascading pattern. I can stabilize individual sections, but the moment I release my focus, the correction unravels. This requires sustained, precise energy application across multiple failure points simultaneously, a task, frustratingly, beyond even my capacity to manage alone. What do you need us for? Vegeta asked. Brute stabilization, Beerus said. I will identify the failure points and the required corrections. You two will need to physically reinforce the containment structure at each point while I address the underlying energy imbalance. It is, I confess, an inelegant solution, but elegance is a luxury we no longer have time to indulge. It was, Goku realized, the first time since their arrival that Beerus had asked for help with anything approaching genuine urgency. A god who existed, by his own admission, largely above the concerns of any single reality, now devoting his full attention and considerable power toward preventing a catastrophe of his own accidental making. Just tell us where to stand, Goku said, already moving toward the reservoir's edge. What followed was 3 grueling hours of the most delicate, sustained effort any of them had faced since their arrival. Beerus directing precise bursts of divine energy toward failure points scattered across the reservoir's vast, unstable expanse, while Goku and Vegeta, moving with a speed and precision that even Earth 3's most advanced sensors struggled to track, physically reinforced containment structures at each point the moment Beerus identified them, holding the ancient, rotted reality's foundational stability together through sheer, combined force of will. By the time the reservoir's energy readings finally settled into something resembling stability, all 3 of them were, for the first time since their arrival in this reality, genuinely exhausted. Beerus drifting low over the now quiet well with the particular weariness of a god who had spent considerably more effort than he cared to admit. Goku and Vegeta slumped against the facility's reinforced walls, breathing hard, the adrenaline of genuine, sustained crisis finally beginning to fade. That, Beerus said finally, was considerably more tedious than I anticipated. You're the one who tore the rift open in the first place, Vegeta pointed out, too exhausted for his usual sharpness. An accident, Beerus said, born of denied pudding, and I will thank you not to bring it up again. Owlman, arriving at the facility's entrance in time to witness the aftermath of the stabilization effort, found himself confronting readings that told a story his careful calculations had never once anticipated. 3 beings from beyond his reality, having no genuine obligation to intervene, spending hours of exhausting effort to prevent a catastrophe that, by any reasonable measure, was not theirs to solve. "You saved the city," Owlman said, quiet, genuinely uncertain how to process the implication. "I saved my own universe," Beerus corrected, which happened in this instance, to require saving yours as well. Do not mistake the alignment of our interests for something more sentimental. But Goku, catching Owlman's eye from where he still sat slumped against the wall, offered a tired, genuine smile that suggested, perhaps, the distinction mattered rather less than Beerus insisted. "Still saved it, though," Goku said. Owlman said nothing, but something in his careful, calculating composure had shifted imperceptibly into territory his decade of ruthless strategy had never once prepared him to navigate. The reservoir crisis, once resolved, left behind a changed political landscape that neither Owlman's careful calculations nor Ultraman's brute force instincts had ever been designed to navigate. A syndicate whose strongest member had been publicly humbled, whose chief strategist had watched outsiders save the city his own empire had failed to protect, and whose entire foundational mythology of strength as legitimacy now stood exposed as fundamentally hollow. Ultraman felt the erosion most acutely of all, and it was this, more than any single tactical consideration, that drove him toward the confrontation that followed. He found Vegeta alone on the tower's reconstructed training level, working through forms with the same restless intensity that had characterized every quiet moment since their arrival. And this time, Ultraman did not crash through the ceiling or announce himself with violence. He simply stood in the doorway, bruised still from their previous encounter, and waited until Vegeta acknowledged him. "I want a rematch," Ultraman said finally. Vegeta paused mid-form, studying him with genuine curiosity rather than immediate hostility. "Why? You lost. Publicly. Adding another loss won't change that." "Because if I don't fight you again," Ultraman said, "on my terms, without interruption, then every faction in this syndicate will spend the rest of my rule believing I only lost because Kakarot intervened before you could finish me. I need to know, myself, whether I could have won, and I need this reality to see the answer, whatever it is." It was, Vegeta had to admit, a request he understood intimately, the particular, gnawing need to know one's own limits, without ambiguity, without the comfort of an interrupted outcome to hide behind. He had spent years of his own life chasing exactly that certainty against Kakarot, and he recognized, in Ultraman's bruised, desperate insistence, an echo of his own oldest wound. "Fine," Vegeta said, "but this time no city, no civilians. No interruptions from Kakarot pretending to be the reasonable one." He allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. "Just you, me, and whatever's left of your pride once we're done." They chose, eventually, a stretch of abandoned industrial wasteland on the city's outer edge, cratered, already ruined by decades of Earth-3's endless internal conflicts, a place where the only casualty of their collision would be ground already too broken to care. The fight that followed was, in its own way, more honest than their first collision had been. No crowd to perform for, no political calculation weighing either combatant's choices. Simply 2 warriors testing the absolute limits of their power against each other with nothing held back. Ultraman fought with a discipline he hadn't shown in the plaza, channeling his fury into something more controlled, more genuinely dangerous, while Vegeta, freed from any obligation to prove a point beyond the fight itself, allowed himself the full, unrestrained expression of scion power he'd been holding carefully in check since their arrival. It ended an hour later, with Ultraman on his knees in a crater of his own making, breathing hard, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, staring up at Vegeta's own battered, exhausted form with something that was no longer fury, no longer denial, but a kind of clear-eyed, devastating clarity. "I couldn't have won," Ultraman said, quiet, almost wondering. "Even without Kakarot's interruption, even at my absolute limit, I couldn't have beaten you." "No," Vegeta agreed, extending a hand, an offer not a demand, and something in the gesture surprised even himself. "You couldn't have. But you fought harder than anyone I've faced in this reality. And you didn't stop even when you knew you were losing. That's not nothing. Ultraman stared at the offered hand for a long moment, old pride warring against a new, unfamiliar recognition, before finally, slowly, accepting it. What happens now? Ultraman asked, rising unsteadily, the crater's rubble shifting beneath his boots. That's not really my decision, Vegeta said. This is your reality, your syndicate. What you do with the fact that you're not the strongest thing in it anymore, that's yours to figure out. It was perhaps the least satisfying answer Ultraman could have received, and also, he recognized slowly, the only honest one available. Because for the first time in his violent, unchallenged existence, he stood at the edge of a genuine choice rather than a predetermined certainty of victory. And the shape of what came next remained, entirely, his own to determine. 3 miles away, in the tower's upper levels, Owlman watched the fight's conclusion through drone footage with the particular, unsettled focus of a man whose entire operating philosophy had just been quietly, thoroughly dismantled. He lost, Deathstorm said, arriving at his shoulder, radioactive form flickering with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been genuine alarm. Publicly, this time. No ambiguity left to hide behind. Yes, Owlman said. So what happens to the syndicate now? Owlman considered the question with more genuine uncertainty than he'd allowed himself in a decade of careful, ruthless calculation. His entire strategic framework had been built on a single foundational premise, that raw power, properly managed, could maintain order indefinitely, provided the strategist behind the throne remained clever enough to channel that power effectively. He had just watched that premise fail in the most public, undeniable way possible. I don't know, Owlman admitted, and the words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar. A strategist confessing genuine uncertainty for perhaps the first time since he'd built this empire from Earth-3's ashes. But I suspect the answer will have considerably less to do with strength going forward, and considerably more to do with whatever comes next once strength stops being the only currency that matters. Below them, in the ruined industrial wasteland, Ultraman and Vegeta walked back toward the city's edge in a silence that carried, for the first time since their arrival, something almost like mutual respect. Two warriors who had tested each other's absolute limits and found, in the aftermath, not humiliation or triumph, but simply a clearer, more honest understanding of exactly where they each stood. The days that followed the wasteland duel unfolded with a quiet, uncertain momentum that none of the tower's careful strategists had ever needed to plan for. Because for the first time in Earth-3's recent history, the Syndicate's hierarchy was being reshaped not through violent coup or sudden betrayal, but through the slow, deliberate accumulation of choices made by people finally freed from the absolute certainty that resistance meant annihilation. Superwoman moved first, and moved carefully, not toward open rebellion, which she recognized would only replace one tyranny with another, but toward the mid-tier commanders and independent factions who had, for years, operated under the Syndicate's boot purely out of fear rather than genuine loyalty. She did not promise them liberation. She promised them, instead, a seat at whatever table came next, and found, to her genuine surprise, that this modest, honest offer proved considerably more persuasive than any grand revolutionary rhetoric might have been. Ultraman, for his part, retreated from the tower's political machinery almost entirely, spending his days instead in quiet, restless training, chasing some new understanding of his own limits that his old, unchallenged existence had never required him to seek. He did not abdicate his position outright. Old pride would not permit that much, not yet, but he stopped, for the first time, making unilateral decisions without at least consulting the fractured council of voices that had, almost overnight, begun asserting themselves within his previously absolute domain. Owlman watched all of it unfold with the particular, unsettled fascination of a strategist witnessing his own carefully constructed system evolve beyond his ability to fully predict or control, and found, against every instinct his decade of ruthless calculation had cultivated, that he did not entirely mind the uncertainty. "You could have stopped this," he said, finding Goku on the tower's observation deck one evening, watching the city's skyline with its ever-present violet glow, now somehow slightly less oppressive than it had seemed on their first day. Superwoman's maneuvering, Ultraman's retreat, the entire hierarchy shifting beneath my feet. A word from you, an alliance with any single faction, could have collapsed this syndicate entirely in a matter of days. I know, Goku said. Why didn't you? Goku considered the question with the same easy, unhurried honesty he brought to everything. Because it's not really my place to decide how your reality rebuilds itself, he said. I could tear this whole thing down if I wanted to. But tearing something down and actually fixing it aren't the same thing, and I don't know your world well enough to know what should come after. That's not my call to make. It's yours. All of yours. That's a remarkably restrained philosophy for someone with your capabilities. Maybe, Goku said, but it's the one that actually makes sense to me. I've seen what happens when someone with enough power just decides everyone else's future for them. Even with good intentions. Doesn't usually end well, even when the person deciding really does mean well. Owlman turned this over carefully, recognizing in it an echo of his own recent, uncomfortable reckoning. A decade spent believing that careful, ruthless control was the only path to stability, now confronted with an alternative philosophy that traded certainty for something messier, slower, but perhaps, in the end, more durable. The reservoir instability, Owlman said, changing tack, has stabilized permanently, according to Beerus's assessment. Which means, as far as I can determine, that the rift he created should also be reaching a point of natural closure within the next day or two. You'll be able to return home. It was the news Goku had been waiting 3 days for, and yet, standing on the observation deck overlooking a city he'd arrived in as an accident and was leaving as something considerably more complicated. He found the prospect landing with less pure relief than he might have expected. That's good, he said, and meant it, though something in his voice carried a weight that surprised even himself. You're going to worry about what happens here after you're gone, Owlman observed, with a particular, unervingly accurate perception that had characterized every one of their interactions since his arrival. A little, Goku admitted. This place still isn't fixed. Ultraman's not exactly a good man just because he lost a fight. Your syndicate's still built on fear, even if the specific fears shifted around a bit. No, Owlman agreed. It isn't fixed. But it's different than it was 3 days ago, and different, in this particular case, happens to be an improvement, however incomplete. He paused, considering his next words with unusual care. I've spent a decade believing that control, absolute and carefully managed, was the only thing standing between this reality and total collapse. I'm no longer entirely certain that was true. That's not nothing, coming from someone who built an empire on believing otherwise. It was, Goku recognized, as close to genuine gratitude as a man like Owlman was likely ever to express, and he accepted it with a simple, easy nod rather than pushing for anything more. For what it's worth, Goku said, I think you're smart enough to figure out whatever comes next. Whether that's helping Ultraman actually become someone worth following, or helping Superwoman build something better, or something else entirely nobody's thought of yet. You clearly don't lack the ability, just maybe needed a reason to point it somewhere other than just holding on to control for its own sake. Owlman said nothing further, but the observation settled into him with a particular weight of a truth he had not asked for and could not quite dismiss. And long after Goku had left the deck to find Vegeta and Beerus for their own preparations, Owlman remained, alone, watching his city skyline with eyes that saw, for the first time in a decade, genuine possibility rather than merely variables to be managed. The rift reopened on a gray, overcast morning, in the same cratered training ground on the city's outer edge where Vegeta and Ultraman had settled their final, honest reckoning. A fitting location, Beerus observed dryly, for an ending that had, by his own admission, begun with considerably less dignity than it now concluded. The scene stable, Beerus said, studying the shimmering, wrongly colored tear in the air before them with the particular satisfaction of a god correcting his own careless mistake. It should hold long enough for us to cross, and once we do, it will close permanently behind us. No further accidents. No further pudding-related catastrophes threatening the fabric of reality. Please don't let it be pudding next time, Vegeta muttered. A small crowd had gathered to see them off. Not the whole city, not some grand theatrical farewell, but a handful of people whose lives had intersected meaningfully with the three visitors' brief, chaotic tenure in this reality. Superwoman stood near the front, arms crossed, expression carrying a complicated mixture of respect and genuine uncertainty about the path ahead. Ultraman stood somewhat apart, still working through the quieter, more difficult reckoning of a man rebuilding his understanding of himself from the ground up. And Owlman characteristically observed from a slight distance, cataloging the moment with the same careful attention he applied to everything, though something in his posture now carried less calculation and more genuine, unguarded curiosity about what came next. The girl Vegeta had pulled from the research facility stood beside Superwoman, small and quiet, watching the preparations with wide, uncertain eyes. She had been given a name. Finally, Superwoman had insisted on it. Some small act of restored dignity after months of anonymous captivity. And though she said nothing as the three visitors prepared to leave, she offered Vegeta a small, hesitant wave that he returned with a stiff, unpracticed nod, uncomfortable with the sentiment, but unwilling to dismiss it either. "You didn't fix this place," Superwoman said, approaching Goku one last time. "You know that, right? Ultraman still got more power than anyone should trust with it. The syndicate's still standing. We've got a long way to go before anything here actually resembles justice." "I know," Goku said, "but I think you've got a real shot at it now. That's more than you had 3 days ago. Because of you three. Because of what you and Owlman and even Ultraman decide to do next," Goku corrected gently. "We just kind of stumbled into the middle of something that was already cracking. What you build out of the pieces, that part's yours." Superwoman studied him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, extended a hand. Not the calculating gesture of their first meeting, but something more genuine, more hard-won. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you fell out of the sky when you did." "Me too," Goku said, shaking it, grinning. Owlman approached last, as the rift's shimmer intensified, signaling the narrowing window for their crossing. "I've recalculated a great many things this week," he said, without preamble. "Most of them uncomfortable. I don't know yet what this syndicate becomes, but I intend to find out, rather than simply managing its decline through fear alone." "That's a good start," Goku said. "Kakarot," Beerus called, already drifting toward the widening seam, tail flicking with impatience. "If you're quite finished with the sentimental farewells, I believe we have a home to return to. And I have a considerable list of complaints for Whis regarding the quality of the custard in this reality." Vegeta was already moving toward the rift, characteristically unwilling to linger on goodbyes any longer than pride demanded, though he paused briefly, to meet Ultraman's gaze one final time. "Get better," Vegeta said, simply. "Not stronger. Better." Ultraman said nothing, but something in his expression suggested the words had landed exactly as intended, settling into a man still working through the difficult, unfamiliar process of becoming something other than what raw, unchallenged power had made him. And then, with no further ceremony, the three of them stepped through the shimmering tear in reality, and Earth. 3 fell away behind them, the rotted violet skyline, the fractured hierarchy, the slow, uncertain work of rebuilding something better from ashes that had, until 3 days ago, seemed permanently, hopelessly settled. The rift closed behind them with a quiet, unremarkable finality, and on the cratered training ground, the small crowd that remained stood for a long moment in silence, processing the sudden absence of the strange, impossible visitors who had, in the span of a single week, cracked open a hierarchy that had stood unchallenged for a decade. "So," Superwoman said finally, turning to Owlman and Ultraman both. "What now?" Neither answered immediately. But for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the silence that followed was not the tense, calculating quiet of rivals awaiting an opportunity to strike. It was something closer to 3 people, however awkwardly, beginning to consider a genuine answer together. They landed back on the training field outside West City in a scatter of displaced grass and startled birds, precisely where they'd vanished 3 days prior, as though the multiverse itself had simply paused their absence and resumed the moment it ended. Whis, seated nearby, with an actual custard tart finally procured from an actual Earth bakery, glanced up at their sudden reappearance with mild, unbothered interest. "Ah," he said, "you're back. Did you enjoy your detour?" "Detour," Beerus repeated, settling onto the grass with the weary satisfaction of a god who had, against every inclination, done something almost resembling good work. Is that what we're calling 3 days of tedious diplomacy, an unstable antimatter reservoir, and the single worst pastry selection I've encountered in several centuries? It's certainly a word for it, Whis said, offering him the custard tart with a knowing smile. Goku sat down heavily in the grass, feeling, for the first time since their sudden arrival in that rotted, violet-lit reality, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 days navigating something considerably more complicated than any physical battle he'd faced in years. Vegeta stood a short distance away, arms crossed, expression unreadable, processing in his own private way everything they'd witnessed, and everything they'd left unfinished. It had been, in the end, a strange kind of victory, not the clean, decisive triumph of a well-fought battle, but something messier, more uncertain, built on the slow accumulation of small choices rather than a single climactic blow. They had not overthrown a tyrant. They had not liberated an oppressed reality through force of arms. They had simply, through their unwilling presence, cracked open a hierarchy built entirely on fear and certainty, and left behind people finally capable of imagining something different. Whether Earth 3 would actually build something better from those cracked foundations remained, deliberately, entirely beyond their knowledge or control. A loose thread Goku found himself thinking about more than he expected, in quiet moments over the following weeks, wondering whether Almond's careful recalculations had led anywhere genuinely different, whether Ultraman had found whatever it was Vegeta's parting words had asked of him, whether the small girl from the research facility had found some measure of the childhood that had been stolen from her. He would never know for certain. That, he understood, was the nature of what they'd stumbled into, not a story with a clean, satisfying ending, but a single brief intervention in a much longer story that would continue, in all its messy uncertainty, long after the rift had closed behind them. Vegeta, for his part, thought less about Earth 3's uncertain future and more about the fight in that cratered wasteland, the honest, unrestrained collision with a being who had, for one brief hour, tested him more thoroughly than anyone since his own long rivalry with Kakarot had begun. It had reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten in the comfortable, settled peace of recent years, the particular, clarifying honesty of a fight fought entirely on its own terms, without politics, without pretense, without anything at stake beyond the simple, absolute truth of who was stronger. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not regret the detour nearly as much as his pride insisted he should. Beerus, characteristically, thought mostly about pudding, though even he found himself returning, in quieter, unguarded moments over the following weeks, to the memory of that unstable reservoir, the genuine effort required to contain it, and the peculiar, unfamiliar satisfaction of having built something rather than destroyed it, however briefly, however far outside his usual inclinations. "We should get back," Goku said eventually, rising from the grass, brushing off his GI. "Chi-Chi's going to want an explanation for where I've been." "Good luck with that," Vegeta said, allowing himself something almost like a genuine smile. "I doubt accidentally fell into a parallel universe because a god was denied dessert is going to satisfy her." "It's the truth, though," Goku said, grinning. "That," Beerus said, rising from the grass with the last of his custard tart in hand, "has never once stopped anything from sounding absurd." They parted ways beneath a sky considerably less violet and considerably more familiar than the one they'd left behind. 3 warriors returned from a brief, strange collision with a reality built on fear, carrying with them not a clean victory, but something quieter and perhaps more lasting, the knowledge that even the most rotted, hopeless hierarchies could crack, given the right unexpected pressure, and that what grew from those cracks was never entirely predetermined. Somewhere across the boundary of realities, in a tower overlooking a city still finding its way toward something better, Owlman watched his monitors with new questions rather than old certainties. Superwoman built careful alliances toward a future she could not yet fully picture, and Ultraman trained alone beneath a violet sky, chasing not strength alone, but something he was only beginning to understand he'd been missing all along. The rift was closed. The visitors were gone. But the cracks they'd left behind remained, slowly, uncertainly, beginning to let in something that had never before had room to grow in that rotted little corner of the multiverse. The genuine, unguaranteed possibility of change. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more epic, what-if adventures like this, consider supporting the channel by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description or the pinned comment. Every contribution, no matter the size, helps bring more stories like this to life, and your support truly means a lot. Thank you for being part of the journey. May the Force be with you. More stories await.